Hello. I think Nina Simone has said it all. And we're so happy to have you here with us. I'm Pat Cruz, and with me is an incredible scholar, author, associate professor of African American literature at the University of Pittsburgh, Michael Sawyer. And we're here on the occasion of the work that Harlem Stage has been doing all year with the Black Arts Movement Examined. This is the 6th in a series of programs that we've done. I hope that each and every one of you have been able to join us for those. If not, perhaps you can come to the conclusion of this series in a conference that we're going to be doing on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday with some incredible scholars who will join us as we wrap this investigation. All of that has been conceived, I should say, by Carl Hancock Rux, who is our Associate Artistic Director and Curator in Residence. This has been his idea and implemented by the incredible staff at Harlem Stage. And we couldn't do any of it without some very special support from the Mellon Foundation, and I want to acknowledge them. I also want to say to you that at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. So please, while Michael and I enjoy this conversation, because that's what it's going to be, a conversation about this period, about a form of Black aesthetics, how it has been formed, how it is a part of a continuum. And we're taking like a slice of that continuum as we look at the Black arts movement that was largely, I think, has been largely attributed to beginning with Amiri Baraka. And back when he was still, I think, Leroy Jones. He made a couple of statements, and I want to situate what we're doing within that context. A part of our earlier showings of this was Baraka's The Dutchman. And I think it's so fitting in terms of the response that we are seeing now in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and what happened as a result of the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement. And that is why we showed those images from the period of the 60s and 70s, the artwork that you just saw, along with some of the more recent work that has been produced by artists who are responding to this contemporary condition. And I think it is a condition that many of us have seen before because it is a part of a continuum. So at one point, Baraka said, and I'm gonna just paraphrase him, that as long as there is racial oppression and violence, there will be artists who use their art to respond to that violence. And I think that certainly in my lifetime, I don't know, outside of that period of the civil rights movement and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, that we are seeing now the assassinations of Black citizens, of Black men, Black women, and we see that there are artists who are responding now as they did then. So with that, I want to be able to talk a little bit about the series that we've been doing, to talk about how it evolved, what from the very beginning, some of the images that you saw were those of Jeff Donaldson and Nelson Stevens, Faith Ringgold, artists that you know now, David Hammonds, who were responding earlier in the 60s and later in the 70s with their artwork. And what we know is that, again, it is a part of a continuum, but what I think is particularly hurtful about it is that if you are without voice, that becomes the problem. I think that, again, we are in a situation where artists have voices, and they've used their voices to establish resistance, to establish another narrative, another way of visioning who we are and what the society is that we live in. So that's what this discussion is about, to look at the impact of art and artists on this. And I wanted to just say one other thing, that as I thought about those earlier movements, I realized that many of the institutions that grew up in Harlem and around the country were institutions that came out of that same response. So that whether one is talking about Arthur Mitchell and the Dance Theater of Harlem, or the Studio Museum in Harlem, there were so many institutions that came into being, the Harlem School of the Arts, and institutions across the country that were responding to the kind of oppression that they felt and the need to form institutions to protect as well as to project our lives and ourselves. So with that, I want to ask Michael a couple of questions that might help to frame the discussion. Michael, you and I have been speaking for a couple of years now. I should cite that Michael is also the author of a very special book called Black-Minded, The Political Philosophy of Malcolm X. So I think he has got a great deal of insight and expertise in this area. But Michael, what I'm interested in is your sense of what the impact is and was, especially during the Black Arts Movement, of the art and the projection of the art on American culture, on world culture, if you will. Just to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think first I just want to, without breaking the flow, I want to just thank you for this opportunity to have this discussion, right? This is so important. And I think the way you've set this up with pointing us to the notion of this continuum becomes exactly where I'd like to begin thinking. I think, most particularly what you've said is that when thinking about the way in which Black people, broadly defined, right, and I'm using Black in the sense that Malcolm X uses Black, which becomes for him a notion of people who are aggrieved, basically, right? The what we would call today the global South, or what he thought of as revolutionary people, are naturally going to find ways in which to document those things that are happening, right? So what was so interesting about the images that we saw at the beginning is that's this kind of that's this long durée of images that both show the actual events and then show artistic response to the events, while at the same time being able to listen to Nina Simone's kind of sonic response to the event, right? So there's a way, at least for me in the way I think about all these things, that there's really no separation between these different modes of expression for me, right? Sound becomes much like art, becomes visual art, becomes much like the event itself, right? They oftentimes begin to become difficult to separate. So I think what was powerful about what this program is doing, and basically, and I believe this is a what I like to call the long Black arts movement, right? That extends kind of before it and also takes up space after it, is it leads us to be able to begin to think about the fact that these different modalities of expression need to be taken as a whole, right? As a whole system of response to collective notions of oppression, collective notions of, in some sense, helplessness, that then gives us just that, us being people who are aggrieved in the way that I'm portraying it, gives us just that opportunity to grapple with this in some sense, right? Because you got to go through it and be able to deal with these kinds of realities, because your point towards the end of what you were saying is like, even now, right? We can't go a day without some outrage that has something to do with Black people being harmed, right? And it's like, And, Nina Simone and what she's talking about from the 1960s basically becomes resonant. The taxonomy of places and spaces she named are the same places and spaces, Memphis, Tennessee, on and on and on, right? We're back to the same conversation again, which means that we're not back to anything. We're just part of the whole kind of space that plastically expands and contracts, that has as its central problematic attacks against positive, what I like to think of as positive Black subjectivity. So to your point, and what happens with these institutions, I think, is they spring up out of that ground, right? And they begin to provide us with, and the world, right? Not just a way of forming the way Black people form themselves as subjects, but also disforming the way white supremacist and anti-Black racism forms us as subjects, right? So there's a core to this entire thing that's about this kind of back and forth that I think when you pointed us to Baraka, Leroy Jones at the time, and person who becomes Amiri Baraka, and even, I can recall what Ishmael Reed said in your series, where he proposes that the notion of Black studies comes out of the fact of Malcolm X's assassination, right? The requirement to just be able to study and deal with these problems. So over time, we go from literature to history to visual art. Sound is always around, right? And to me, it often feels like a kind of tidal flow where one of these modes will become preeminent in a certain sense, but they're always part of a larger continuum, both with respect to the events that they're addressing, but also with respect to their relationship between all of them. And, I can't not but see the things that Nina Simone is talking about when she's, talking about the horror of the 16th Street Baptist Church and on and on and on, right? What all that means, and these assassinations that cause her to be almost unable to function. So I think art becomes a type of safety valve in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that's interesting is you talk about the correlation between the music, spoken word, and then painting and photography and sculpture, is that frequently, and maybe I was more aware of it during that period because I was very much a part of this, that the art that was made was usually done in concert with many different forms. So
Right.
you would have one of the things that I've been reading about from George Lewis's work, which is very important here, where you're really looking at artists who are painting while musicians are playing. So that if you're talking about the Art Ensemble of Chicago and the poetry that is being read by Talani Davis or many of the other artists that we've had on our program, without a Leo Smith, to look at the fact that these forms were very integrated and not as one might approach it in academia, which is you study music over here and you study the visual arts over there and you study poetry and literature. But there was this sense that it was all of a piece.
Right.
And I'm not so sure how much that is still prevalent right now. We're working with a lot of younger artists who are responding in this way, but I think a part of what has happened in academia, there is usually an insistence on you're doing one or the other. So people are trained in this way to kind of edit themselves,
Right.
and not necessarily cross the boundaries that have been established. So I do think that you're right, and perhaps you can speak a little bit more about that and this issue of the continuum, because
Yeah.
as you and I have spoken, we've talked about a number of artists who were doing this same thing, not only in the most recent period of the civil rights movement, but certainly back to the Harlem Renaissance and the periods that preceded that. So perhaps you can talk about your theory of this Black continuum and the evolution of a Black aesthetic.
Yeah, I think I'll approach that from, I think one of the most important things that you point us to is to think about the way academia can prevent us from being able to effectively grapple with these things, right? And I think you're right, that there's a period of time that where Black studies becomes disciplined, right? And when I say disciplined, when I say Black studies started off as being undisciplined, I don't mean that in a negative formation. It's undisciplined because it didn't want to be bogged down with having to grapple with the limitations that disciplines often will provide, right? So if you look at, the great Black Studies department at UMass Amherst, where, Max Roach was there, Archie Shepp was there, Achebe's there, it's like all this, it's just incredible list of artists, writers, poets, playwrights, visual artists, et cetera, who are all there thinking about these things at the same time, because there's a way, and I think this is right. The continuum of the problematic requires a particular type of continuum to address it. And that continuum cannot limit itself to a particular discipline in order to have a particular type of positive effect. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm against disciplines, right? But I just think that what an individual has to do is, if they're doing that, right? If I'm a thinker who's going to say, I want to study Black literature and I want to limit the four corners of what I'm doing going to be focused on Black literature, I'm going to use that language and I'm going to present it in that way. That's fine, but that ought not be a point of limiting what other people are doing, or the way in which that your work can be pulled into other people's work in order to enhance it, right? Who may not have as deep dive into literature as others might. I think that the other thing that you point us to is to think very carefully about what it means to have academics or the academy be the place where this is happening, because as a matter of fact, students, and I get at this by thinking about what's the kind of positive and important role that students have always played in radical movements, right? So if you think about, Stokely Carmichael and the rest of these people, they're students, right? They're at school thinking about things, learning, they're in a group, and it provides a place of departure. But what's happened is, and I think this is a response to the radicalism that came out of Black studies in at its best in the 60s and 70s, is just that, to try to render it an inward focused kind of very disciplined enterprise where you don't have to worry about it trickling out to be something that is dealt with in the community. Because I think these kind of spaces and places that you point to where all these things are happening at once are basically Black communal spaces, because we do a lot of things at once, right? And that's what makes Black sociality what it is, right? It's like you don't show up at places Black people only doing one thing. Like you go to someone's house, it's like, why is there no music playing? Or why is there no, you don't go there, there's nothing happening, right? So I think the Black art and Black studies at its best is just that, right? An undisciplined kind of approach that is grabbing whatever it can in order to present just what you're proposing, right? A way to kind of express, in some ways, the unexpressible. And I think, and I'll just be brief and then get back to what you're thinking about, because I want to hear more about where you're headed, is if you think about the events that are being addressed here, and I know, you think about these great anthems that come out of these movements, right? Mississippi Goddamn, Alabama, Strange Fruit, Max Roach's Triptych, these performance pieces. To me, Mississippi Goddamn and Alabama stick out in particular because they're not abstract, right? They're abstract in a certain way, but they're talking about a particular event. And they're talking about in the way that Strange Fruit is talking about a particular type of regime of terror. What happens with Alabama and Mississippi Goddamn in particular is Nina Simone and Coltrane are both talking about an event that happens, and they want to get as close to it as possible, right? And be able to give people a type of process of lamentation that then shows up in many ways visually, right? So then visual art responds to the music responds to literature responds to events, and it's this like circle that keeps rolling forward. And what happens what happens in the negative formation of what the institutions of education try to do, and this is, explicit in what we hear now with this notion of the stop woke movement, is just that, to stop the kind of profound energy that comes out of being able to pay careful attention to something and do it in a social group with a bunch of different people who may be approaching the problem from different directions. I think that's what is a necessity for us to get back to, and visuality in me sits in the middle of that project.
Yeah. It's incredibly interesting because I was thinking, we started the slides with the wall of respect. We showed the civil rights movement and the impact of that and the way people were beaten and abused in an effort to get their rights and be treated like humanity. They were treated instead like animals. But when you look at the Wall of Respect in Chicago, that was done in 1967, I believe, what happens is there is also this kind of insistence not only on those kind of myriad forms coming together, the different disciplines merging into one, there is this engagement in community. And at that Wall of Respect was critical for that. I want to just read this quote that George Lewis pulled from Jeff Donaldson in the formation of one of the Black Arts Movement organizations that was seminal at the beginning. And this was an Obasi's founding manifesto. It says, cultural expression was viewed as a useful weapon in the struggle for Black liberation. The group agreed that the essential function of a people's art was to build self-esteem and to stimulate revolutionary action. That's a tall order, of course. And what I'm interested in was to find out if you think that there was some lasting impact that actually came out of the art, whether it's, you know, in fashion, in some of the things that we showed, those images, what becomes the impact on the spirit and the mind of the people who are viewing that? Yeah.
I mean, I think, no, that's a really complex quote. And I'm often when I see it, I'm always drawn to think about the way in which George Lewis is basically naming culture as a weapon, right? So
this is quoting Jeff.
Jeff, And appropriately in doing that is to point to the fact that any activity that tends to destabilize the security of anti-Black racism and white supremacy is violent, right? Even a painting that is explicitly not physically violent becomes a weapon, right? And it's a weapon to kind of destabilize that. And in doing so, creates a type of collective consciousness, to get to your point about what are the resonance or the echoes of that, right? And I think that, you know, you can't think about where we're at in modern culture and where music is gone, where visual art is gone, where literature is gone, without thinking about the Black arts movement, right? And how it sits in like the middle of, as an aggregator in many ways of what was going on from the prior to the Harlem Renaissance to that point, then a point of departure with spoken word, right? Because the sound of Black radicalism is to me the soundtrack of Baraka's voice and a drum and a bass and that art and those images that come out of that, right? The Wall of Respect, all those images that you're pointing to, right? That are meant to, in my mind, create a type of cultural, long enduring cultural formation that becomes a font of inspiration, a place of historical record, and also a point of departure and resonance for artists who come behind that, right? And those who want to resist it, right? So even in not participating in that particular vernacular is also a type of revolutionary activity, right? To say that I want to do something that's different or aside or perpendicular to what the kind of core of what we think of the Black arts movement in whatever these modes of expression we're talking about becomes in and of itself a type of revolutionary act and a capture of an important type of Black freedom, right? And I like to think back to Nina Simone again, where we started with this, right? And I remember in, you know, the documentary, What Happened, Miss Simone, right? There's that interview towards the end where she says she would have been much happier if she could just have been a classical musician, right?
Yeah, no, I know.
And to me, what she's saying is what she's saying, and really is like she'd be much happier if there were no white supremacy, because then she could have been like, because the totality of why she wasn't allowed to be a classical musician and had to respond to all these things is because of white supremacy. So in order for the world that would have allowed Nina Simone from someplace in the middle of North Carolina to be a classical pianist is a world that does not have white supremacy. And so just in that kind of statement of fact about her art practice then becomes just that way for us to think about the continuum of white supremacy as an enduring type of problem that we have to figure out how to eradicate. Because, you know, to paraphrase it, Nina Simone should have been a classical musician, right? And there would be no bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church for her to write Mississippi Goddamn About. So we would not have to be having this conversation, which would mean the world is a much different place, right? And that's what she's asking. And the fact of the matter that it isn't, then it's exactly the point that you're making. That becomes the way in which we have a touchstone for the way in which these things are a trajectory that just keeps returning. And we have to keep fighting these same fights and doing the same things over and over again to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that you're right. In many ways, the making of the art and doing it the way you can do it, or are allowed to do it in this particular society, becomes an act of resistance.
Yeah.
And for me, the question becomes, how does that act of resistance resonate within the society? For me, you know, a long time ago, I realized, or at least I thought I realized, I don't know exactly anymore, but at a certain moment, I thought that I was able to walk down the street and be proud to be a Black person because I knew there was a Coltrane, and I knew there was a Miles Davis, and I knew that we had made achievements and cultural contributions that proved our humanity, even though it was being questioned. So that for Nina Simone, of course, to not be able to be a classical musician, and I know I've read those same things about her hurt behind that. And then when you think of her the success of her output and the impact of that. And I'm wondering if there is what you might consider a comparable impact of the visual arts. I mean, we know that the force and power of a song or of a solo or of even, you know, a film, all the things that people have done, that Black folks have done, Black artists have done, a composition. How does that work when you're seeing The Wall of Respect, or one of the works that came out of the Cobra movement in Chicago, of which there were many similar movements around the country? And I think what I wanted to point out also is not only were people joining movements with manifestos or without manifestos, but joining movements. But there were many people who were not joiners, but instead were making their own work in a way that showed resistance. And I would cite Mel Edwards's Lynch fragments as a part of that. I don't remember Mel being a part of any movement at that time, but he's made his statement of resistance with that sculptural form.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you're making a really interesting point that's in some ways a type of paradox, right? Because to consciously not be a part of a movement is actually to acknowledge the kind of four corners of the movement and be able to point yourself in directions that are basically in many ways responding to that boundary, right? To operate beyond that boundary is itself a kind of revolutionary act, and also to acknowledge the power and importance of a particular movement, right? Like if it has nothing to do with you, it doesn't even matter to say that you're not part of some particular movement, right? But to expressly need to be able to say that, and also to perform it in ways that create a type of cultural artifact that then has resonance is an important act, right? In many ways, to this point, kind of a revolutionary activity where that quote ends up. I think the resonance of the visual speaks to, you know, kind of the notion of where we're at with this notion. What I want to do is think about both a continuum of events and also a continuum of cultural production, meaning that these things basically flow into one another. And in many ways, at the points of crossing, they become indistinguishable from one another, right? So to your point, I think there's a great deal of just the visuality, the color, the imagery, all of that has a particular type of motion and sound to it that feels like Blackness to me, right? That just feels like, I was born in 67 in Chicago, and I remember as early as I can remember anything, just driving around those areas and just the color that was explicit in the murals and stuff that were on the walls, right? And the viaducts over there off of King Drive and those places we would see just artists had gone there and produced these like documents that become in many ways the kind of, along with what you were hearing from the 1970s in the sonics field and what you were reading, also becomes the visual part that becomes the backdrop for all of that, on which this kind of Blackness is written on top of in a particular way, right? So I would say that abstractly and also in concrete form, Blackness, and that's what I want to get to, is this term, right? I want to in many ways marshal the term Blackness for where we're at, right? Blackness becomes the thing upon which we write our world, right? And some of that is written in Black, and some of it is written in color, and some of it is written in words, and some of it is written in sound. And that backdrop to me is the visuality and spectacularity of Blackness kind of generally. So I think that everything that we see, whether we're looking at, kind of modern artists, to your point, that are dealing with Ferguson, or artists who are explicitly working in, back to figuration, or working in abstraction, or working wherever, they're all basically saying, I'm shouting this, to your point, right? I'm proud to be Black, right? Because Coltrane gave us these things, because Miles did, because, on and on, because of what came out of here, where I'm at in Pittsburgh, right? With Bearden, right? What Bearden's up to, right? With just, collage, all these kinds of things, right? And even modern art that you can, you can't go any place in New York City now without seeing some gallery that's showing, Black art in a particular way, right? So then even the archiving of it in these other institutions that had excluded Black art for the longest period of time, it creates a new kind of dynamic, right? That is both a new type of freedom and a new type of restrictive regime that we also have to take stock of all the time, right? So the question for me is, to your point, is what do we learn about ourselves as we rotate around? And the visuality of it becomes, to me, the kind of center, if not, I have a professor that said this, right? Like Patricia Rose said when I was in grad school, she's like, Black people paint stuff, Black people sculpt things, Black people write stuff, but they do nothing so much as make music. But it's about the painting, the sculpting, and the writing, right? And the music becomes the thing that's like taking stock of all these things at the same time, right? Which is where we started. We started with Nina Simone and visuality, then we get to, the kind of conversation, which seems perfectly reasonable to me and doesn't create the kind of artificial boundaries of disciplines that you were talking about, and with the visual being the kind of center term.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And what's so wonderful is that whole idea of what happened, when you think of Max Roach and We Insist, and the whole resistance to apartheid and the freeing of Nelson Mandela. So there's all of that has taken place, but also I think what we're seeing now, and that's what's so interesting, and we're trying to build those bridges in this series to connect the continuum, so that it's not seen as either an echo or a cycle or a reverberation, but a continuum. And certainly, looking at just the work that is now coming into being, just as you've said, is so prevalent, to see Black artists in museums, to see Black curators in museums, where those positions were never allowed in the past. So that comes directly out of the Black Lives Matter movement. So there, those two things, you have Black power, you have the civil rights, you have Black power, and then you have Black Lives Matter, and you have pieces that were in the slideshow of Kehinde Wile's work that really shows those individuals who were killed and martyred as martyred in terms of his sculpture. And I think it's an incredible statement, as I have with Carrie Mae Weems, who's been doing photography that looks at and examines Black folks and has grown in terms of her engagement with and stimulation by the things that are happening now. So artists who have been a part of this continuum can now take this moment and magnify it. which is so interesting to me because if you look at it as a whole, it is absolutely a continuum. And I think one of the things that you and I have talked about is the emergent Afrofuturist movement, and how that is a part of this evolution. And I don't know what you think about how that might fit in to where we've been and where we're going.
Yeah, I think, part of the continuum that we see in visual art and in sound is first to capture the imagery of the individual Black body, right? To be like, here I am, and see me, right? Because for the longest time, this is Ellison, right? The kind of the visible invisibility of the Black body, right? Mm-hmm. You're there, but you're kind of not there, right? So I think that what we see is a kind of art practice that first becomes, then the kind of separation between the abstract and kind of capturing type of realism, or even what's happening with photography, that then leads naturally to the notion of Afrofuturism, is to be imagining the continuum of Black subjectivity that goes from the eruption of the I am a man, right? To, to say that, right? I am human, to your point, right? To capture the humanity of Black people, right? I'm human flesh, right? And being human flesh, I then create these things. And some of these things are going to be creations that reflect on my body. Some of these things are going to be creations that reflect on the conditions around me. Some of these things are going to be reflections of the conditions that harm my body. And the Afrofuturist movement is thinking about the conditions of a world where that body is free in a particular kind of way, right? Yeah. And that body emerges in ways, and I'm thinking about Mutu's, that I saw last week when I was in New York, right? The kind of these bodies that are almost impossibly Black, right? Like in certain kinds of ways, right? And then melded into animals, or melded into, positions or forms that seem, futuristic, or in some ways, prehistoric in some ways, right?
Yeah, anthropomorphic and all.
Yeah, all that, right? And to think about, what does all that mean, right? To kind of mar to the point of positivity, the human animal binary, right? To be like, we are animals, and would that mean we are human animals? And as human animals, we also interact in a particular way with the animal kingdom, and there's nothing wrong with that. And we can capture that as a type of futuristic understanding of something that comes out of what we know about the past, right? And so Afrofuturism in many ways, and Afro-surrealism are movements that I think are both forward and backward looking, and part of this and essential elements of the continuum, because it captures the imaginary, right? And the power of the imaginary in that way.
And certainly, I mean, that's evident in so much African art. Yeah. From the past, out of which, I mean, when we look at the great traditions of the African visual art area, we frequently talk about the drum, but clearly that sense of power and being able to transform one's own environment in the process of creating art,
right?
Which is a kind of magical power. And in many ways, the artist is a kind of shaman that is transforming what he or she is seeing, and somehow in that process, engaging us in that vision. And for me, one of the things that has been so delightful of being at Harlem Stage and working there, in working with artists, is that their works enable me as the viewer of their work to see the world differently.
Right.
And I get a sense of, I have the ability to share their vision. And it could be very different from what I thought.
Yeah.
But to be exposed to that thinking is something that expands, my horizons and my sense of self. And it's something that when we talk about the work that we do at Harlem Stage, we talk about discovering the new, but also we look at ourselves at the intersection of art and social justice. And it's not like we're curating that. We're not asking artists to make work about equality or equity or social justice even, but they come to that on their own. And we are helping them to develop and realize that work, which is what our mission has been for almost 40 years.
Yeah, and I think it's important what you're saying, because to this point, right, we can't leave out these institutions, and Harlem State's been one of them, that provides the kind of spatiality necessary for that creativity, right? It's magic, to your point, right? It comes out of, it's a blank page, it's an empty room with no sound, with no movement, and all of a sudden this thing happens, right? And when it happens properly, it does just that, right? It allows you to think about the world differently. And
Yeah.
it may last forever. It may only be for that moment that you're encountering the art. It may be something that you hear. I've heard things before that gave me a certain feeling, or seen them, and you can never recreate it again, because it's just not, even if you try it, right? It's just not, the things don't line up properly, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a type of magic. And I think that's what art practice, to the point that we've been on the entire time, right? The kind of world-changing, radical potentiality of various types of art practice. And in this realm, the visual becomes exactly that type of place of potentiality.
And it changes fashion. It changes the way you walk down the street. Right. It changes the way you look at another person and exchange. It's how then is that transformation made clear verbally? Right. The linguistic issues that come into play in terms of invention. Yeah. In that regard. So I think that it's, for me, it is hard to kind of define and make distinctions between the impact of the various forms, because I have integrated them all in my head. I see them all as related. But that's why I was asking you about, so what is the impact? How are we transformed by seeing these images? And, finally, for someone like me and our institution, what is your responsibility to make that, to allow others to be transformed? Right. In the process of viewing and seeing and thinking, because I think that's what we intend. And that's what we're trying to do as much as possible.
Yeah, I'll take a step just to kind of try to answer you in careful fashion, right? I think the impact of the visual does two things, right? It creates profound types of possibilities, but also rigidly memorializes certain things, right? And I'm thinking about what we were looking at, just, that kind of picture at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? That's like seared in my mind forever, right? I remember the first time I saw it, and I know that image will always be there, right? So that's a particular snapshot, literally, of a particular time and space. But now what it does is it creates the potential for you to see it again, right? And it becomes a category of thinking. And so then when you see violence is being committed against Black people in Ferguson, or 2 summers ago in New York City, or wherever it's happening, right? You're like, this feels like and looks like the impact of that image, right? And that one is very real because it's photography, but it's the same thing. I think it tends to kind of levels of abstraction as well, where, it both memorializes something, but also memorializes a type of potentiality that then for the viewer becomes a type of response, a synergistic kind of response relationship, but also for other artists, whatever their mode of expression happens to be, it becomes a point of departure. And I think that's what's powerful about this type of Black art at its best, right? When it's at its best, I think that's exactly what it does. It memorializes, but at the same time becomes a place of departure. Yeah,
I love that. I love the idea that artists and community and individuals can expand their own sense of their potential. And, because one of the things that happens for me, Michael, is in the everyday work that we do. And I love so much that we're able to do it and have been doing it for 40 years almost. We're on the cusp of that anniversary. But looking at the artists who have come through and been seen there, whether one is talking about Sekou Sundiata or Craig Harris or many of the artists, the dancers, because we are a performing arts institution. We have not, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing this conversation as a Zoom conversation, because we're not a visual arts organization, but it would have been probably unconscionable for us not to at least talk about and think about the visual arts and the way that it has been integrated into our sensibilities, into our understanding. And that is something that I'm so pleased that we have been able to talk about. I know that we have, and I want to give you the last word if there are any observations that you have. I know we have offered the opportunity for those who are joining us for this conversation to come in with questions. So I hope that those of you who are watching are using that little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to pose questions, and our managing director is going to pull your questions out, and we will be able to hear from you, because we want this to be a participation. I said at the very top that we will be concluding this incredibly rich series, and it has been that, from the incredible work of artists looking at Mikkel Lerman doing a tap dance, a tap performance, to Max Roach and Abby Lincoln, and We Insist, to all of the programs that we've been doing since for this year that will conclude. And as we conclude with this 3-day conference, we will bring Henry Threadgill back with his music, but we'll also have some of the earlier founders like A.B. Spellman, Quincy Troop will be there. We'll have any number, Nona Hendricks will be there with us, Toshi Regan, all for the conference. And we actually secured Angela Davis to be a part of this, so that we're really looking at this, everything we're doing, which is an integration of our lives as human beings, our lives as creative producers, but also to understand the relationship, that the proclamation of our humanity becomes a form of resistance.
Right.
And frequently I kind of forget that, and I think, well, what more can I do? What else can I do that's really going to make a difference, so that we as a society can be more respectful, have more respect awarded to and accorded to Black folks, because we've contributed a lot to this culture. And I think it's important and an imperative that we make it as broadly known as possible. So with that, I think what we can do is, hopefully you all will be able to go online, get your tickets for the conference, because they're going to be moving quickly. And we'd love to have you do that. But I think what we want to do is to have, open it up to your Q&A, your questions. And Eric Oberstein is going to read some of the questions that have already been submitted. And I do hope that those of you who have not posed a question yet feel comfortable doing it. We want to hear from you. If we're missing stuff, talk about that. If you think we need to add something else as we move forward, not with this conversation, but with our thinking and our programming in the future, we want to hear from you. So Eric, do you want to jump in here and
you bet, Pat.
What our participants are thinking?
Absolutely. So we've got 2 questions and a comment from Carrie. Carrie asks, Pat, do you feel Emilio was a part of the Black arts movement? 1. 2, what do you think about the Spiral group? And then 3, a comment. In painting, there was such a disconnect between the pure abstraction of the 1960s and the content necessary for activist art?
Oh, Carrie, you are the one who inspired me to do this. You know that. Carrie came out of one of our programs in which we were introducing the show, and she said, well, wait, I don't see anything about the visual arts. And I was like, right. Because I didn't feel qualified as an institution that's a performing arts institution to handle that. So in answer to your question, I believe that Emilio was actually resistant to the idea of what he considered a nationalist aesthetic that did not embrace world culture and did not engage with world culture on a regular basis. So it was very interesting that he was not, I would not say that he was considered a part of the movement. However, in 1967, I think that was the year, yeah, we went down to St. Louis when he became a part of the Black Arts group that was in St. Louis that included what became the World Saxophone Quartet and many of the artists who came out of that movement out of St. Louis, because it was national. And that's where we met the Art Ensemble of Chicago, AACM. So a lot of the musicians, more than visual artists. But so Emilio was a part of that. Spiral Group is very interesting because I think that there were many artists who came together around the commonalities of living in a society that did not necessarily accept their work, but they came together in a way to strengthen one another. And while it was not anything that I would have considered the Black arts movement, it certainly was comprised of Black artists who were asserting an aesthetic that they considered their own. So that's part one. And part two, there was a part three. I have no idea what that part three was, Carrie.
Part three was a comment.
Oh,
In painting, there was such a disconnect between the pure abstraction of the 60s and the content necessary for activist art.
yeah. And I think artists kind of adapted to that. I remember, you know, there's a whole school of artists who came, and I'll name one name, William T. Williams, was making just that, completely abstract art. And it, you know, there were questions for many of the Black artists who weren't doing obviously Black art, and they were doing abstraction. And some of them were ostracized because of that, or at least criticized. And I remember William saying, well, actually, this abstraction is taken from the fractured linoleum on my kitchen floor. And it was a funny way to blend the idea of abstraction with the idea of socially relevant material. So, Karen,
Right.
I hope I'm responding to your comment as well as your excellent questions. Thank you.
And just a quick response from Mike Mosher to Carrie's comment and what you've said, Pat. Thanks for that comment, Carrie. I understand there was a big debate between non-objective and very illustrative artists, certainly in Detroit, and I believe in Los Angeles too.
One of the things that's interesting about that also is I wonder if many people know here the relationship of David Hammons to figurative work that was definitely, you know, that had certainly a critique of racism. So one of the images that we showed here was his body prints with an American flag. And he did a lot of that work in the very beginning of his career when he was based out in California, and then came to New York, still doing work that alluded to certainly Black life, like Higher Goals, those basketball images that he had that were like 25 feet into the air. and the work that he's doing now, which is more purely abstract in terms of the way I see it. So also artists have a tendency, when they have the freedom to do it, to move from one form of an aesthetic to another, which I think is great. You know, if you get stuck and you can only do one thing, which is frequently what the market calls for. And I think that that's one of the big differences, Michael, in terms of this idea of production. If you're locked out of museums and you're locked out of galleries, you don't have the same kind of strictures that come out of the marketplace.
Right.
Because once you enter the marketplace, there is a whole nother perception of what you can do and when you can do it and how you can do it.
Mhm.
And Kinshasa Holman Conwell has said, yes, and also where we at Black women, I may get some of these pronunciations incorrectly, Weusi, Kamonge Workshop, and West Coast Black artists. You showed Betty Sar Hooray, Suzanne Johnson, John Outerbridge. Of course, I don't expect you to name each of them, but I urge us all to revisit Edwards, Williams, and Gilliam, and happy birthday, Carrie.
Carrie has, okay. Carrie, who has a birthday?
Sounds like Carrie's birthday.
Okay, I didn't know that, but Kinshasa, I'm so glad to hear from you because, you know, you gave me a lot to think about. Just so that you all know, Kinshasa Holman Conwell is the just recently retired deputy director of the Smithsonian's African American Museum of Art and Culture. So she knows from which she speaks, and certainly has spoken to the West Coast and the East Coast as my prior boss at the Studio Museum in Harlem. So we have history.
And she says, yes, please don't put artists in the box of abstract or figurative of any other dyads.
Right, we're trying to avoid building boxes, Kinshasa, trying.
All right, so we've got a couple questions from Romeo. Romeo says, do you think there's been a big change on what Black art accomplishes in the past versus now? And also, should young artists strive to follow their elders or pave their own path?
Do you want to take that, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think necessarily things change, right? And I don't want to be reductive in saying that, right? But yeah, the power of the art is necessarily different in the environment we have now, because I mean, the technological environment is different, right? So the ability to kind of view things is significantly different than it had been before, right? So art in many ways, and the visual culture in many ways, has a larger brief and moves more rapidly. So I don't know that we've been able to take stock from a perspective of theories of social movements, et cetera, that we've been able to effectively take stock of just this question. What is the rapid movement of imagery around the world have to do with the way we process and the way we develop radical movements at all, right? The second part of it was about whether artists should follow their elders or make their own way. Yeah, both, right? You should be aware, I think, you know, naturally, right? You should be aware of the canon, and then be aware of how the intellectual genealogy of which someone's participating in. I think is a super important kind of question, which I think is the entire point of the series that you put together, right? To kind of situate the intellectual genealogy of Black art, Black radical making, and Black radical thinking, at the same time as in providing a platform for thinking beyond that, right? What is the next thing that then understands where it's coming from and understands the resonance and understands the continuum? I think is so essentially important, because I don't think we're anywhere if we just allow ourselves to act as if nothing has happened before us and nothing's going to happen after. So,
Right, I agree.
And we've got Carl Hancock Rux with us, our curator of this Black Arts Movement Examined series. Hi, Carl. Carl says, I'm very interested in how this conversation centers itself on visual art. Do you think visual art serves as linguistic of not just pride, but also of erasure, altering and making intelligible an interpretation of Black culture in a way that had not been done before? Which is to say, in America, art may or may not teach us that there's no such thing as a unified Blackness, but rather a common linguistic of being Afro or African centered?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I spent a lot of time on this question, I think, and I proceed, and thanks for that, right? I proceeded this from, in many ways, from Morrison, right? Because in Beloved, she asked this question, how do you make into words things that are pictures, right? And I think what happens is, and so the language or the vernacular and or the vocabulary of Black art includes the vocabulary of the visual, right? So I think what I want to be careful about and assemble, what I was trying to assemble in this conversation at one point was to think about an event like the 16th Street Baptist Church that then creates an actual visual, right? That we can see in our minds, right? What that all looked like, right? Then creates music, then creates art, then creates, and these things are all interrelated. So to me, that kind of linguistic, the question of language that's being raised is multidimensional. And just like we were urged not to create dyads that separate typologies of Black art internal to the visual, I would also like not to create boundaries that I feel in many ways are artificial between the type of acts, speech acts, visual acts, sonic acts, whatever movement that then are meant to respond to exactly these type of external stimuli. So I think it's important to think of the visual as a type of hieroglyphic resonance of actual events that then becomes exactly that thing that Morrison is asking. How do you take things that are pictures and render them into words? Because to me, the visual art then becomes a type of language practice. And so I agree. I think where Carl's going with that, I agree that it's a linguistic, it's an actual, it's a production of a particular discourse, right? And that type of artistic practice becomes yet another tool in the toolbox or weapon, back to where we were with the quote that you provide us, in exactly that assemblage.
Great, thank you.
Did you speak to Afrocobra of the Midwest and Chicago? That's a comment from one of our attendees. They're not identified by name, but yeah, if you could say a little bit about Afrocobra.
I spoke, the quote I did it during the beginning of this or the middle, wherever we were, was from Jeff Donaldson, who was one of the founders of Afrocobra. And they had various names. The Coalition of Revolutionary Black Artists was one of them. And then it later became the Coalition of the African Commune of Bad Revolutionary Artists.
Right.
So it had, the acronym became kind of had its own evolution. So we did speak about that. And certainly one of the things that's so interesting about the period is that many of the artists of that period went on to teach in schools across the country. So there was an impact. Jeff Donaldson went on to teach at Howard. I think Nelson Stevens was there as well, just as you talked about Max Roach and Archie Shepp and Cecil Taylor going up to Amherst. So they were, in fact, spreading the gospel of both the music and the art and an aesthetic, which I think has resonance for us still. And we see that in many iterations. So I would say that about those movements. And I would refer you to some of the works like George Lewis's works on this. And I'm not in his book, a greater, what I'm trying to remember the name of his book. But at any rate, I think that he has spoken extensively about that, so that we can extend our learning in such a way that is certainly needs to be beyond this conversation. This is just a kind of teaser, an appetizer, if you will, so that people can go off and explore more and, come to Harlem Stage for some of the programs that we're doing, and to the many other institutions. We're doing a whole coalition of programming around Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and some of the programs that we've devised with them will be shown in institutions throughout Harlem. And we're doing that with the Maisels Cinema organization, as well as with the Jazz Museum, the National Jazz Museum of Harlem. So we're really working with the Schomburg, the Studio Museum, in an effort to spread the word on these incredible works that have come out of Black artists, and without identifying a period. So.
A couple of quick comments from Kinshasa on what Michael and Carl were saying earlier. Indeed, Michael and Carl, so interesting that many of the folks on the visual side of the Black arts movement cross boundaries all the time. Thanks also for the sonic. Among current artists, please note Keith and Mendy Obadike, brilliant sonic artists.
Thank
Great.
you for that. I'm glad to be reminded of them.
Yeah.
We've done a lot of stuff at the new school, and we need to look at how we might engage them, Kinshasa. I think it's a good lead on that, a good guide. Michael has done some sonic work as well. You want to speak about the work that you've been doing in that area, Michael?
Yeah, I can do. I don't know if there was one more question. I think it'll kind of speak to this, and then I can talk about that just briefly.
Sure. Yeah. This next question, Michael, would you define or share what you mean when you use the term Black radical? And is it something that has come to be in the now, or is it different from the ethos of earlier groups of the 60s?
Yeah, I mean, I think a Black radical is a person who practices Black radicalism, and Black radicalism is any effort to destabilize the structures of white supremacy, right? Put kind of simply, right? So and certainly that is an evolving kind of practice, right? That meant one thing for the Black Panther Party and means something different to student movements now that are dealing with that are focused on police violence. Police violence becomes in many ways the middle term here, which in that way gets me to talk about the sonic assemblage that Pat is talking about. So a couple of years ago, I was interested in the sound of police violence. So what I did is I found sound from instances of police violence from across the country and kind of wove them together in a tableau that tells a story of the encounter, the kind of conflict, and then the resolution of it. And Nicholas Payton, the trumpet player, composed it, right, with the musical score that goes along with it. And this is what I was talking about in some ways and gesturing at what I feel is going on with, in particular, Nina Simone and Coltrane's encounter with an actual event, right? So what I was trying to do with that is to take a series of actual events that we have sound from that is a new kind of practice, right? We don't necessarily have over the long durée of the mortification of Black bodies, we don't often have the sound and visuality that we have now, right? Except in particular, these instances that are historical photographs. We have a lot of record keeping now from body cam videos, et cetera, that then becomes a particular type of thing that I want to see an artist respond to in that moment, right? And that's what that sound project is composed of.
That's great.
Yeah, Freedom Now becomes exactly that type of thing. And I mentioned that when I was saying that becomes included in that conversation as a particular type of abstract response that's in some ways informs what Coltrane and Nina Simone are up to with addressing a particular event. And in Coltrane's sense, he's addressing the actual formation and tenor of Dr. King's eulogy of the 4 children that were killed, right, on that day after. He says that forms to this point, right, the kind of resonance and the lamentation that he's doing is to respond to Dr. King in a particular way. So it's back to this continuum question. So
I just want to add, I don't know if there are any other questions. I think we're about at time. I did want to correct myself to at least say George Lewis's book, A Power Stronger Than Itself. I didn't say the title of that. But I do want to thank you all for being with us. Please stay with us in terms of a communion that I think, we can continue to build a community of folks who support our artists and allow us to live together in a world that they've helped us to shape.